Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. And I'm George Binns, and the guest this evening is our City Councilor-at-Large Brenan Sweeney, one of three, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, George. Appreciate the chance to join here.
What the interest in tonight's show is really about is there's at least three big issues from my perspective of things that are going on with the city council and drawing a lot of interest in town.
Definitely.
The overlay had a meeting last week, went for about 2 hours. A lot of people came out and discussed it. I think they said about 100 people showed up for that one. A week before, I think you had a meeting about the national grid and where they're going to dig up the streets or not dig up the streets to put that extension in or the replacement high voltage line. And then there's the City Charteer that's lurking in the background. Not much has been said about that.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, but like you say, that's one of the big ones kind of things. So since the most recent one was the overlay, we'll start with that. Basically, the idea is to reclaim the land and essentially the businesses that were there along the Bass River and up to the railroad station. And there's a lot of ideas on what should happen with that, what it should be. And is there any consensus on the city council yet, or are they just still listening? Or
So yeah, that's a good matter to bring up, very timely matter. It's worth clarifying, so the mayor has not given a formal proposal to the city council yet. So on the piece, we're very much still in the listening phase, trying to hear what the administration would like to see for the area, listening to residents, particularly those who live in Goat Hill or Ryleside, the two adjacent neighborhoods to where this activity would be taking place. And so the way the timeline has been laid out now is we've held, the mayor and various civic associations have held public meetings with residents to hear their thoughts on any potential development, which has been very helpful for me as a counselor to hear directly from the residents. The plan is that those will continue through the spring, and the mayor actually recently updated his timeline for a proposal to no longer take place this spring, so it won't come before the city council in April as we originally thought would be the case, but instead will likely be something that we either take up in the fall or at the start of the next year, 2023.
Yeah, this seems to be a characteristic of this project, because I remember listening to that video about the Monday night town hall meeting, and the word out was, we've been working at this for 20 years, and I'm somewhat surprised that in 20 years the city can't come up with a consensus of what do we want to do with that land.
Sure, so it's an interesting balance, and it is, I know, something the mayor in previous redevelopment plans had flagged the Bass River District as a potential opportunity for growth. It was labeled as such in the master plan. So that's when you hear the discussion from the administration about, this is something we've talked about for years. It's because it had been discussed in those plans. But the intensity of the conversation didn't really reach the level it's at now until probably the last few months from the election cycle onward, I would say.
Yeah.
And so what is really interesting, going back to the piece about the balance, is it's certainly a prime area close to the train station, right in the edge of downtown, where if we could foster potential redevelopment, certainly I think that would be a benefit to our city. Where the balancing act comes in, and this is where I've appreciated resident concerns and I've been digging into the matter more myself, is that you have to take into account that it's a small area geographically. The river itself, there's some environmental concerns both with the sediment in the river, but then potential flooding concerns. And it's an area that the traffic infrastructure, so the roadways themselves, in the current state they're in, probably can't handle some of the potential number of units, upwards of 1,000 that have been discussed. I have some concerns about public infrastructure as well. And so, I see the area as certainly one that, we could, as a city, find more value out of any redevelopment, particularly some commercial first floor development, open space, especially on the riverfront, is something that I think would be beneficial to our city in that area. I do have some big concerns about what can our infrastructure hold, particularly if we are to add a notable number of units. Presumably those tenants would have cars. Can we actually on River and Bridge Street handle that increase in cars, given that, there's some traffic concerns already?
Well, some of the discussion got around to the point of, for any of the buildings that go up, there would be commercial rental space or condos. They haven't decided which, I guess. There's only going to be a requirement for one parking space per unit, which to some extent limits the amount of traffic you're going to get. But at the same time, it almost requires that these have got to be TOD, transient-oriented development oriented dwellings. So we're really importing people into the Beverly area from Boston, which TOD is all about anyway. And yeah, they're going to come in here, and I think the mayor made a point that I was somewhat surprised at. There aren't that many kids in the Rantoul Street development so far. And they're thinking about 1 per 34 units or some number like that.
Yeah, that was the figure he cited this past Monday.
Yeah, and really that's driven by the kind of units you put in. And if all you're going to put in is single bedroom or studio apartments, that's not going to attract the family. And that gets to the other issue that, okay, somebody moves into this area, they like it. I moved in here 55 years ago and I'm still here. Is that it works nicely for me, but where do they go from here? They can't stay in the single bedroom or condo and have a bunch of kids.
Exactly, and that's where it's important that when you think about any new housing development in Beverly, whether it's the Bass River or across the city, we need to think holistically about what our needs are. And so I'm recently married. My wife and I have been renting downtown. We're looking to buy a house in Beverly in the near future, but it's certainly expensive to find a single-family home in Beverly. And this is where I want to make sure we're continuing the conversation and really getting the full spread of data in front of us. The argument has been that if you add more of the studio 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartments in a multifamily format where we are able to do so downtown, that would allow the younger people who may be living with their parents and otherwise can't afford a place to hopefully find something given the increase in capacity of apartments. And then the empty nesters that would like to sell their single family home, downsize to a more walkable part of the city, could be able to do that. The challenge becomes, and this is something that I'm acutely aware of given the Sedna development and others that have added an influx of studio 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartments, they're not really affordable. And that's something you think about with this area. The goal, which I believe, having talked to people throughout the campaign, plenty of folks are supportive of adding to our affordable housing stock in the city, or at least, finding better options for working class folks that otherwise are getting priced out. But just while adding to the housing stock will help chip away, if we're solely adding these more high-end luxury unit 1-2-bedroom apartments that are significantly out of the price range of those who would like to move out of their parents' house or those who would want to downsize, then are we really meeting our holistic need? And that's something that I've appreciated the conversations we've had so far and saying with any development here, one, we need to make sure we're scaling to what we can handle as a city, not overdeveloping an area that the infrastructure may not be fully prepared for. And then two, if we're adding units, we need to make sure that we are trying to target an increase in our affordable housing stock or our, just reasonably priced housing stock even, as opposed to just adding luxury units for the sake of building.
Well, that was the point that Don Preston made as the first presenter, of that if we go by the state formula of some percentage of the median income, we're getting into a funny situation that the median income for the city of Beverly is driven mostly by the people that live in single-family houses. That's where the money is, because if you didn't have the money, you wouldn't be able to buy one of those things. And the net result is there's a whole class of workers between the school system. I've heard it mentioned a couple times, a teacher fresh out of college.
Yep.
The service workers and all this vibrant community we're developing downtown, they are struggling to find places locally.
Exactly.
And when you start to talk about affordable housing to the state formula, they're automatically priced out of the range. So I think I like the comment that Andrew DeFenza made one time, that really what we need is housing that is affordable.
Yeah.
Which is different than the formula. And again, I guess the question for the overlay is, how are you going to find a developer willing to put in housing that a typical service worker can afford?
And that's where we are in an interesting situation here. And the way that the mayor has pitched it is, and I'm not sure I necessarily agree with this, we'll see as the data is presented and as we hear more about the details of the proposal, but that idea that you need to build a larger unit in order to have a situation where it is economically feasible for a developer to build affordable, deed-restricted affordable units within an overall development, they would need to then have an adequate balance of market rate units and those deed-restricted affordable units that presumably they would, if not lose money, see less of a profit from. What I think is an interesting tool that we have, and it's something that I look forward to discussing with the council as a whole, is with an overlay district, we can write in affordability requirements instead of just relying on what is allowed in our inclusionary housing ordinance. And so under that ordinance, it's a certain number per units.
It's 12%, I think, is the magic number.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Right in that range where they have to provide affordable units, but the alternatives being they can provide those units off-site, working with a nonprofit developer, or otherwise provide the units in an entirely different location, or they can make a payment, qualifying payment to the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And so that's the standard across the city. What we could do in this instance is mandate affordability metrics within the overlay district without allowing those options to divert the units off-site somewhere or to pay into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So it's a balancing act. It's something that I look forward to further discussing with the mayor and other members of the council as we first receive a proposal from the mayor and then dive greater into the
One
details.
of the problems with the payments to the trust fund is that the trust fund gets some money, but they can't afford to buy the land anyway. So it sounds good when you say, well, we're going to donate some money so you can do something. But I think the example I keep using is if I look at the assessed value of the property around my neighborhood, it's $1 million an acre. I don't see the city buying too many acres at that rate and then giving them to somebody to develop, which is what they would have to do. So the issue gets lost in the shuffle of how do we make this happen, and everybody's moving around. And the net result is there are people that are working in the city that can't afford to live here.
Exactly, and that's where I think it's really important, going back to that piece, we need to holistically assess the state of housing in our city with the goals that we want people who grew up in Beverly to be able to stay here. We want those who want to downsize to be able to afford to rent a unit downtown, and we want to make sure that anybody who works in Beverly can live either in Beverly or reasonably close and not need to drive down from New Hampshire because that's the only place that they can find an affordable house.
Yeah, Paul Guanci made that point that some of the people that work for him drive in from New Hampshire. And at the same time, we're still looking at the situation that there's a lot of people. And one of the things that bothered me so much about the Plan Beverly is they never came up with a supply and demand curve for the housing, which would lay out very succinctly how many people are working here, earning how much money, what can they afford, and how many units are available for that class or that group of people. And without that fundamental information, you and I can talk about it all night, and there's nothing definitive comes out of it.
And an important factor in that equation, too, is how notably the workforce has shifted as a result of COVID-19. And so going back to one of your earlier points about the assumption that, any units built in a potential overlay in the Bass River would be 1 car per unit, that was when people were taking the train into work in Boston every single day. We now know that, for me, I work in Boston, but I'm in a hybrid work format. So I spend, just as much of my week working from home here in Beverly as I do actually going into Boston, going into the State House. So that, I think, changes the equation as well. People, while they may not use their cars frequently, if they're working remotely, they're going to need a car to drive to the grocery store or otherwise get around. And so...
Well, that gets to the other point about having a neighborhood that is inclusive. That is there any place you can walk in downtown Beverly to buy a week's groceries?
Yeah, and in this case,
the answer is no, there's nothing there. And similarly, when you start to talk about having kids in the buildings, well, they're going to be very young kids with a young family starting. Are there any daycares within walking distance? Are there any preschools in walking distance? And I mean, there's a whole class of support structure that needs to be included. And I think this is one of the things I'm missing in this discussion of who's worrying about these things and who's making adjustments to the plan so that, oh yeah, we'll have a daycare within the building or within walking distance.
And that's why I was glad to hear. I think these are important conversations to have, and it's crucial that we look at the big picture and not just the short term, we're adding to our housing goal. That's good. I do think that's good, but there's also, the positive and negative externalities of any development that you really need to assess at the same time when you consider what proposal to accept. And I'm glad to hear the mayor has delayed his plan for presenting to the city council a formal proposal and has also brought down the planned number of units. Originally, the conversation was around 1,000 units. And
I've heard 1,400 at one time, too.
Yeah, that was, so the consultant that originally contracted with the city, I believe they're still working with them, but they had included the National Grid parcel in their estimates, and as we know, that's not developable. Yeah, National Grid wouldn't sell anyways.
Okay.
But then the number came down to 1,000, which still, between 2015 to now, across the whole city, only 700 or so units were developed. So that would be still a very significant number, and goes back to my concerns about whether our infrastructure, both the public school infrastructure, but then also physical infrastructure, roadways, could handle that. The mayor's said that the proposal that ultimately is given before the city council will be less than that 1,000 units. And, still in the listing process here. I've heard from residents on both ends of, whether they support a proposal or opposed to it, or they could support a proposal that's more scaled down, and I look forward to continuing those conversations.
Yes, it's going to be a long summer, I think.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. The other issue that has been kicked around back and forth is National Grid in there.
Yeah.
What is the path they're going to take? And I think one of the things that bothered me about it, I was very adamant that, you had a line running next to the railroad tracks before. Why can't you put it back? And I think you and I have had this discussion, emails, that all of a sudden it just dawned on me that OSHA is the new ingredient, that it wasn't involved 50 some odd years ago when they put that other line in. So all of a sudden the ground rules changed, and it's going to be kind of hard to...
Yeah, so it's a frustrating situation. I've had plenty of conversations with Mike Collins and our engineering team, with National Grid. What is the biggest challenge for the city in this project is that the way the utility siting process in Massachusetts operates is that a large conglomerate like National Grid first goes to a state-level bureaucracy, the Energy Facilities Siting Board, for approval. And so they worked with the Energy Facilities Siting Board in proposing alternative routes. The MBTA right-of-way was one of them, and the Siting Board determined that the arguments National Grid made as to why the MBTA right-of-way wasn't feasible, and those arguments were that the space doesn't exist, given that the current line needs to continue operating, and that the time of construction restrictions to limited number of hours in the morning when the trains are otherwise not operational, makes it infeasible to complete the work in, a reasonable time frame. And those were the arguments that National Grid made to the state, not to the city. And the state's Energy Facility Siting Board approved the plan that we are currently looking at today. And so what's frustrating is, while the city council controls the grant of location, at this point the mayor has signed a memorandum of agreement with National Grid dictating baseline terms. And what we're looking at is what additional terms need to be added, particularly around the amount of funding that National Grid will pay the city to repave the roads, given the spike in the cost of materials in the last 2 years since this agreement was originally finalized with the mayor and National Grid. I think certainly we need to reassess that number before signing anything. But then also terms of construction, given that people are working from home. That wasn't the case, 2 years ago before the pandemic. We need to make sure that there's noise mitigation measures, that parking restrictions are considered, and that otherwise any inconvenience is mitigated to the fullest extent of National Grid's abilities based on what the city council is willing to press them on. They may not want to concede certain things that we otherwise are going to look to push in the grant of location. But what's challenging, and this is a situation that Woburn, Winchester, and Wakefield found themselves in a few years ago. A large utility went to the state, got approval for a route, presents to the municipality. Residents were rightly concerned. The municipality ultimately decides to deny a grant of location. They didn't even want to work with the utility. The state overruled that decision and the project went ahead. And so that's what's so frustrating to us as city councilors is the state's already weighed in on this, and that really cuts the legs out under the city to push for potentially an alternative route, because we know that if National Grid were to appeal to the state would side with National Grid.
It seems a strange way to do business.
It's frustrating.
You're building essentially a workshop every 1,500 feet from the bridge all the way out to, Colin Street.
It's a long route. It consumes a good chunk of the city.
3.1, 3.2 miles. And I keep thinking of all the stories about laying a cable across the Atlantic, and it was one complete cable all the way. They didn't make splices but I guess they got problems with the existing line that being an oil-filled tube with a line
the technology's changed, but it's certainly important that we haven't approved anything yet at the city council level, and so I appreciate the residents that came to speak at our public hearing on the 28th. That's continued to this Monday, so I'd encourage those watching at home that would like to chime in on how the project is going to impact them and to make sure National Grid hears their concerns, to please join us on Monday.
One of the things that rings a bell with me is that we had National Grid come through in the neighborhood and put a new gas line in. And there were days when I couldn't get in and out of my garage because they had this trench in the street in front of it. So we had to get warning in advance, move the cars to a side street so that we could still function. And
these are the things that, while National Grid, they've put plans together, they've assured us they'll address them. We need to make sure that we're explicit in the grant of location in defining the parameters of, they need to make sure the residents can get in and out of their driveway in an accessible manner, and that, for any parking lost during work in front of somebody's house, that there is alternative parking options that really, so that it's going to be an inconvenience, especially if we ultimately approve this project in the form that's proposed.
It's going to be an inconvenience, but
we need to hold them accountable to
You've got to be able to manage it.
Exactly.
Kind of thing. And same thing, we're getting fire and rescue teams in and out of places too. The other issue that's coming up before the city council is the charter. And I haven't heard much on that. It's in the background. It's under the weeds.
So Tim Flaherty, former Councilor Flaherty, who has chaired the city's charter commission, is scheduled to present to the city council this coming Monday. So we'll have a very busy meeting this Monday. But so we did receive a report from the charter commission that we'll dive into greater detail upon. But there were some notable changes proposed by this commission. I would say the two biggest ones The first would be extending the mayoral term from 2 to 4 years. And the second proposal would be adding 2 school committee members to our existing 7-member school committee to bring it to 9 members. And so we'll consider there's a handful of other technical changes as well.
The 2 new members, whether they're going to be at large?
They would be district councilors. So the way the proposal is shown is so you have your ward councilors, your 6 ward councilors, the mayor. That's the current 7-member school committee. There would be 1 additional councilor to split or to represent all of wards 1, 2, and 3, and then another councilor to represent wards 4, 5, and 6. So it would be semi-at-large.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Personally, I'd like to see the city get a manager.
It's interesting. So my background, as you know, is on the professional side of government, and I've worked closely with municipalities that do have that town manager form of government.
And we used to have a city council that was a city manager over in Marblehead. So there is experienced people around. But anyway, we've had a half hour worth of fun.
Yeah, we'll have to dive deeper into the charter. It's a big one. It will be discussed throughout the next month or so.
Monday, when you get some more information, you got a better feel for where it's going. Would like to invite you back, and maybe you can start on the charter and see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll probably fill a whole show with just discussion on the charter. It's exciting.
Fine, it's worth talking about.
Definitely,
Yeah.
it's important.
Yep. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And as the councilor said, we're going to probably do some more on this. So stay tuned. And incidentally, at the end of the credits, you'll notice my email address. If you have some thoughts on the show, or would like to express some thoughts, there's room for you at the table. Thanks again for watching.